Gerald Rutherford Ford was born July 14, 1913. He served in the Navy during World War II and was later a member of the House of Representatives. He also served 8 years as the House Minority Leader. Ford was voted by Congress to be president after the Watergate scandal. Because he was not voted by the masses, some considered him to be an illegitimate president. Many also considered him to be not that bright because of him being a former college football player. Ford also gave Nixon a full pardon, which further lessened his popularity. James Earl Carter Jr. was born October 1st, 1924, and goes by Jimmy. He grew up in Georgia and worked as a peanut farmer and was the governor of Georgia. He ran for the president under the Democrats in 1976. His opposing candidate was Ford, who narrowly defeated Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination. Carter not only ran against Ford, he also ran against the idea of Nixon and Watergate by forming his campaign against a corrupt government. Many supported him because he was an outsider from the older, corrupt government. Carter barely won the election, with getting 51% of the popular vote. The electoral count was 297 to 240. Carter won almost all the southern states except for Virginia and won 97% of the African American vote. He also got the majority of the white Southerners' vote, which shows that
Despite
the
civil rights
South no
movements in the
longer only
1960s,
votes
they
for the
faced some
Republicans.
challenges in the 70s. In the Supreme Court case Milliken v. Braley under Gerald Ford, they ruled that desegregation plans couldn't require students to move across school district lines. This exempted suburban schools from taking any impact of desegregation, as many people continued white flight out of the inner cities into suburbs, leaving desegregation into the war white neighborhoods. Reactions against civil rights movements were seen in the 70s, as many felt that African Americans were given too much rights and now had more than white people. As many white workers were denied advancements and colleges denied them more, this led to cries of reverse discrimination. This led to the Supreme Court case of Regents University of Cal versus Bake under the Carter administration, which ruled that colleges can't accept students based on their race, minority, or not. Rights movements were also seen in the Carter administration. Movements for greater reservation sovereignty led to the Supreme Court case of U.S. v. Wheeler, which declared that tribes had their own unique sovereignty and weren't subject to their state but rather Congress as a whole. Also, Carter passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which protected the rights and religion and other cultural practices to all Native American people. Through the Ford and Carter administration, there was a massive feminism fight to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. After it was left to the states to ratify, feminism groups began massively campaigning for states to ratify, and was especially seen at a massive march for it in D.C. in 1978. However, a lack of states ratified due to the fears of how it would affect the family environment. Even though not enough states ratified, Carter controversially extended the deadline, but it ultimately failed, and the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution died out in 1981.
During Ford's presidency, the economy experienced a continued inflation from Nixon's presidency known as the Nixon Wave. The 1970s marked the end of the post-World War II economic boom and led to a time of serious inflation. One contributing factor to the inflation were the after-effects of the Vietnam War. The U.S. had spent about $118 billion, and all this money went overseas, greatly disrupting the balance of money at home and decreased the value of the American dollar. Also, industries were focused on producing war products, not consumer products, creating scarcity and thus leading to inflation. All these problems hurt the people's confidence in the government's capabilities in regulating the American economy. Additionally, after World War II, major American businesses were very successful and outcompeted other businesses to the point where they decided that they needed no more change. However, Japan and Germany soon created new factories with up-to-date technology and management techniques. These factories began to rival the American factories, and then in the 1970s, the Japanese even dominated certain industries, such as automobiles, steel, and consumer electronics. The energy crisis of the 1970s also greatly added onto the burden of the American economy. The 1973 oil crisis led to oil shortages throughout the U.S. and led to increasing oil prices. America began to depend on different countries for sources of oil, particularly in the Middle East, and this led to increasing problems abroad. President Ford began a program known as the Whip Inflation Now, which asked the people to wear win buttons and reduce consumer spending and consumption. However, this program didn't work, and the U.S. fell into the worst recession since the Great Depression. Ford immediately switched his economic plan, introducing a one-year tax reduction plan of $16 million to stimulate the economic growth, and then passed the more demanding Tax Reductions Act of 1975. He then passed the Revenue Adjustment Act of 1975, which was a combination of tax and spending cuts. The economy did recover in 1976, but the people were not happy with the way Ford handled the economy, and that the government had such a huge deficit. During Carter's presidency, the U.S. economy experienced another onset of inflation. The effects of the Vietnam War, the energy crisis, the competition from foreign countries, and a growing federal budget continued to hurt the economy. Inflation rates during this time increased to well above 13% in 1980. The increasing rates led to a higher cost of living, and around 1981, the cost of living even tripled. The government budget led to the decreasing value of the American dollar, which caused the elderly and people with fixed incomes to struggle, while people that had the money to lend pushed interest rates even higher, hoping that this would protect themselves from depreciating dollars. Small businesses that relied on loans, such as the construction industry, were barely surviving. In 1979, another energy crisis occurred. The OPEC had doubled oil prices, leading to increasing interest rates and decreasing economic growth, jobs, and consumer confidence. In response to the crisis, in July 1979, Carter had held a meeting at Camp David, which is a presidential mountain hideaway, with all kinds of leaders around the world. On July 15th, he came down from the mountain and delivered his Malaise speech that criticized the Americans for being too focused on material goods, such as oil. These economic changes in the 1970s hurt the American pride. The days of the great economic boom in the post-World War II era had ended. America had dropped out of the Vietnam War, and the economy was taking a huge hit.
When Ford took office in August 1974, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe negotiations had been underway in Helsinki, Finland for nearly 2 years. The American public saw this as apparent recognition of Soviet domination of Europe, but the new emphasis on human rights would actually weaken the Eastern Bloc. Ford continued Nixon's policy of pulling out of Vietnam. However, Ford wanted to help the South Vietnamese fight against the communists, so he requested financial aid to the South. But it was rejected by Congress, and it eventually led to the downfall of the Southern regime. The fall of the South was symbolized by the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The capture of the city was preceded by Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation of almost all the American civilian and military personnel in Saigon, along with tens of thousands of South Vietnamese refugees. This was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Carter's greatest triumphs were in the form of his foreign policy. He met up with Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT II agreement. However, none of these measures were ever ratified by the Soviet legislature or Congress due to the invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1980 to prop up a communist regime in Afghanistan. However, the Western powers saw this as a war of aggression and boycotted the 1980 Olympics. In hopes of gaining another ally in the Cold War, Carter sought closer relations with the People's Republic of China. These two countries increasingly collaborated against the Soviets, and Carter consented to the Chinese invasion of Vietnam. Carter also stopped recognizing the island nation of Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China, and also began selling weapons to the Chinese and sharing military intelligence. The Shah of Iran had been a U.S. ally since the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, supplying America with dependable source of oil exports. In turn, the Carter administration sold high-grade weapons to the Iranians, such as the F-14 Tomcat, to the Iranian. However, due to economic conditions inside Iran, the Iranian Revolution had broken out. A group of Iranian students stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took 66 American captives, beginning the Iranian hostage crisis. Carter tried to rescue these hostages using Operation Eagle Claw. However, this operation proved unsuccessful and resulted in the deaths of several U.S. servicemen. This issue was not resolved until Reagan took office. This and his inability to improve economic conditions back in America were contributing factors to Carter's loss against Reagan. This concludes our Ford and Carter short documentary film. I hope you enjoyed.